They found the photographs in 2003, buried in a metal box beneath what used to be the officers' barracks. Black and white images that made no sense. German guards sitting at tables with American prisoners, sharing meals, laughing. The historians who discovered them thought it was propaganda at first. Staged photos meant to fool the Red Cross. But then they found the letters, dozens of them, and the story they told was so strange, so impossible, that it stayed classified for another 15 years. This is that story. Winter of 1944, somewhere in the mountains of Bavaria. The war was entering its darkest phase, and everyone knew it. Camp Edelweiss wasn't supposed to exist on any official map. It was a holding facility for Allied airmen shot down over German territory, bomber crews mostly, men who had rained fire on German cities, and now found themselves behind barbed wire, waiting for a war to end that seemed like it never would. The camp held maybe 200 prisoners. The guard force was smaller than it should have been. 40 men. Most of them were too old or too broken to fight on the Eastern Front. This wasn't the death camp. It wasn't one of those places where humanity went to die. But it wasn't mercy either. It was just a forgotten piece of the war machine grinding on because no one had told it to stop. The commandant was a man named Klaus Brenner, 58 years old. He had fought in the First War and lost 2 fingers on his left hand at Verdun. He walked with a limp that got worse in the cold. The prisoners watched him every morning as he made his rounds, his breath fogging in the freezing air, his eyes scanning the fence line like he was looking for something that was never there. The men didn't fear him the way they feared other camp commanders. They just didn't understand him. He rarely shouted, he rarely punished. He simply existed in the same cold, hungry space they did, counting down days to an end none of them could see. The winter that year came early and stayed late. By December, the supply trucks had stopped arriving on schedule. First, it was once a week, then once every 2 weeks. By January, 3 weeks had passed without a delivery. The German guards were eating the same rations as the prisoners: watery soup, bread that was more sawdust than flour, potatoes when they were lucky. The cold was so deep that men woke up with frost on their eyelashes. The stoves in the barracks barely worked. Frostbite took toes and fingers. Pneumonia took lives. On both sides of the wire, men were dying from the same enemy: winter. One morning in late January, Brenner gathered his guards in the administration building. The prisoners could see them through the windows, standing in a loose circle, their faces gray and hollow. No one knew what was being said, but when the meeting ended, something had changed. You could feel it in the way the guards moved. Slower, more uncertain. That afternoon, Brenner did something no one expected. He opened the main gate and walked into the prisoner compound alone. No weapon, no escort. Just a tired old man with a limp, walking toward 200 enemy soldiers who had every reason to hate him. He stopped in the center of the yard. The prisoners formed a silent ring around him. The wind howled through the pines beyond the fence. Brenner stood there for a long moment, his breath rising in clouds, his eyes moving from face to face. Then he spoke. His English was rough but clear. He told them the supply trucks weren't coming. He told them the war was lost, even if Berlin wouldn't admit it. He told them that his men were starving just like they were, and that if they didn't work together, none of them would see spring. The silence that followed was so heavy you could feel it pressing down on the snow. One of the prisoners, a pilot named Robert Hayes from Ohio, stepped forward. He was 24 but looked 40. Burns on his face from when his bomber went down. He stared at Brenner for what felt like forever. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What are you proposing?" Brenner's answer was simple. "We share everything. Food, work, shelter. The fence stays up because it has to, but inside these walls, we survive the same way. Together, or we die the same way. Alone." Some of the prisoners wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it. But hunger is louder than pride, and cold is louder than hate. That night, for the first time, the guards and prisoners ate together. Not in the same room. That came later. But they ate the same portions, cooked in the same kitchen, divided with the same cold fairness. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't forgiveness. It was something more desperate than that. It was survival stripped down to its most basic truth. We are all just men trying not to freeze to death. The days that followed created a rhythm no one could have predicted. Work details became mixed units. German guards and American prisoners, side by side, chopping wood, repairing roofs, hauling water from the frozen stream a mile beyond the camp. The officers on both sides of the war hated it. They wrote reports that would never be sent. They argued about protocol and honor and duty. But the enlisted men, the ones doing the actual work of staying alive, they stopped caring about the arguments. They cared about whether the stove would stay lit through the night. They cared about whether the bread ration would come tomorrow. They cared about the man next to them pulling his weight, regardless of the uniform he wore. By February, the barriers had dissolved in ways that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. Guards played cards with prisoners. They traded cigarettes and stories. They learned each other's names. A German corporal named Friedrich taught an American tail gunner how to make soup from pine needles and tree bark. An American radio operator from Brooklyn shared his grandmother's recipe for stretching flour into something that almost resembled cake. They celebrated birthdays together. They buried the dead together. When a young guard named Peter died from pneumonia, the prisoners carved his name into a wooden cross and planted it on the hill behind the camp. When an American navigator named Sullivan froze to death in his sleep, the German guards gave up part of their rations to make sure he had a proper burial. But outside the wire, the war hadn't stopped, and the world that created Camp Edelweiss had no space for what was happening inside it. In early March, a staff car arrived without warning. 2 SS officers from Munich sent to inspect the camp and deliver new orders. They stepped out of that car and into a nightmare they couldn't comprehend. They saw prisoners and guards standing together by the kitchen. They saw a German sergeant teaching an American how to repair a boot. They saw men on both sides of a war that was supposed to be absolute, acting like the war didn't exist at all. The senior SS officer was a man named Strasser. Cold eyes, clean uniform. The kind of man who believed in the purity of orders and the simplicity of enemies. He walked through the camp in silence, his face growing darker with every step. Then he returned to Brenner's office and closed the door. The prisoners and guards stood in the yard, waiting. They could hear shouting. They could hear Brenner's voice, quieter but firm, answering accusations they couldn't make out. An hour passed. Then the door opened. Strasser emerged, his face twisted with something between disgust and disbelief. He looked at the assembled men, both prisoners and guards, and his voice cut through the cold like a blade. This ends now. The orders were clear. The arrangement was over. The prisoners would return to their barracks and stay there. The guards would resume their posts. Discipline would be restored. Anyone who disobeyed would face immediate consequences. And Brenner would be relieved of command and transported to Munich for court-martial. Dereliction of duty, collaboration with the enemy, betrayal of the Reich. That night, as Brenner packed his few belongings in the commandant's quarters, something happened that the SS officers would never report, something that would only appear decades later in those buried letters. The guards and prisoners gathered by the fence line, standing on opposite sides of the wire like they had in the beginning. But everything was different now. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just stood there in the darkness, bearing witness to something that had existed for 6 weeks and would never exist again. The next morning, Brenner was taken away. The new commandant arrived by evening, a younger man, a true believer. The fence became a wall again. The meals became separate. The silence became hostile. And everyone who had lived through those 6 weeks learned the same terrible lesson. The world doesn't want complicated truths. It wants simple enemies and clear sides. It wants a story that makes sense. But here's what the world didn't know, what it couldn't know.
What Brenner told them was this: the war was over in everything but name. The orders coming from Munich weren't about discipline. They were about covering up the collapse. The SS was burning records, eliminating witnesses, and Camp Edelweiss, with its impossible arrangement, was evidence of the wrong kind. The kind that suggested German soldiers chose mercy over orders. Brenner's voice was steady when he explained what would happen next. The new commandant would restore traditional operations. The prisoners would be used as leverage or executed. The guards who participated in the arrangement would be reassigned to punishment battalions or disappeared. No one in that room would survive the next 2 months if they followed the normal course of the war. So Brenner proposed something insane: an escape. Not just for the prisoners, for everyone. They would stage it carefully, make it look like an uprising. The prisoners would overpower the guards and disappear into the mountains. The guards who wanted to come would strip off their uniforms and join them. It would be chaos, but chaos was the only cover they had left. A German sergeant named Otto Keller spoke first, 37, a school teacher with a wife and 2 daughters in Hamburg. He looked at Brenner with exhausted eyes. "Where would we go?" "Switzerland, 200 miles south through mountain passes thick with snow. Neutral ground. The prisoners would be interned as Allied soldiers, the German guards as refugees. Not free, but alive." It was a long shot wrapped in a desperate prayer, but it was the only shot they had. They spent 3 days planning. They chose a moonless night in mid-March when the new commandant would be away. They gathered supplies, forged requisition papers, studied maps of mountain passes. Every detail mattered. One mistake and they would all die. The night came, bitterly cold, temperature below 0. Just after midnight it began. Shouting from the prisoner barracks, a fight that sounded real because it was real. The distraction was perfect. The main gate unlocked from inside. No shots, no alarms, just a silent stream of men slipping through the fence into the trees. 43 men total. 28 Americans, 15 Germans. Behind them, the guards who stayed fired weapons into the air, smashed furniture, created evidence of a violent breakout. When the commandant returned 2 days later, he found a camp in shambles and a story that made sense. Prisoners rioted, guards fought heroically. The escapees would freeze to death in the mountains. Not treason, just chaos. The men moved through the mountains like ghosts, traveled at night, hid during the day in caves and abandoned shelters. The cold was merciless. They lost 2 men in the first week, a German corporal who broke his leg and died from shock, an American gunner whose frostbite turned to gangrene. They buried them shallow in frozen ground and kept moving. They ate snow for water, trapped rabbits when they could, rationed stolen supplies. But something strange happened during those weeks. The divisions that had defined them became distant and abstract. What mattered was simpler: the man next to you, the shelter ahead, the next sunrise. Robert Hayes, the burned pilot from Ohio, walked beside Friedrich, the German corporal who taught him to make pine needle soup. They shared a blanket at night, pooling body heat. When Friedrich's boots fell apart, Hayes gave him a pair from one of the dead. When Hayes twisted his ankle, Friedrich carried his pack for 2 days without being asked. 15 days in, they encountered a German army patrol. 6 soldiers on a supply run. The groups saw each other across a narrow valley. Silence stretched thin. The patrol had weapons ready. They could see the mix of uniforms. Deserters, traitors. Otto stepped forward, hands raised, and shouted. He told them the truth. The war was over. They were heading to Switzerland. The patrol could come or report what they'd seen. Their choice. The young patrol leader stared across that valley, finger on his trigger. Then he lowered his weapon and asked a single question. "Do you have food?" 11 more men joined that night. They had supplies and a map showing Swiss positions. 40 miles out. 3 days if the weather held. But the next morning, Hayes was coughing blood. The burns on his face had infected weeks ago. Now fever set in. He could barely walk. Friedrich insisted on carrying him. They fashioned a stretcher from branches and coats. It slowed them dangerously. Some argued they should leave him. Otto ended it with 5 words. "We all go or none go." 3 more days pushing through the mountains. Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness. On the 3rd night, sheltering in monastery ruins, he woke clear-headed. Friedrich sat beside him. Hayes looked at this German soldier who had become a brother in a way the war never intended, and he smiled. "I'm not going to make it." Friedrich shook his head. 2 days, you'll make it." But Hayes knew. He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket, a letter he had been writing since they left. Names and addresses, proof of what happened. He pressed it into Friedrich's hand. "Make sure someone knows. Make sure this wasn't for nothing." He died before dawn. They buried him in the monastery courtyard, marked his grave with stones arranged in a cross. 27 men stood in snow and cold, Americans and Germans, and said prayers in 2 languages for a pilot from Ohio who should have been their enemy. The Swiss border was 30 miles away. They covered it in 2 days, moving faster now, driven by desperation and hope. They could see the border posts in the distance, Swiss flags flying in mountain wind. Freedom, or at least survival. They crossed just after sunset, 53 men stepping over an invisible line that separated war from peace. Swiss border troops met them with drawn weapons and confusion. The story they told sounded impossible. The Swiss separated them immediately. Interrogations, medical checks, identity verification. The Americans were eventually transferred to Allied custody and sent home, quietly discharged with vague records. The German guards were held as refugees. Some stayed in Switzerland, others returned home to find their houses destroyed, families dead. Otto made it back to Hamburg in 1946. His house was rubble. His wife and 2 daughters had died in the firebombing. He lived another 40 years, teaching history, never speaking publicly about the mountains. But he kept Hayes's letter. When he died in 1986, his son found it and brought it to a historian in Berlin. That's how the story came to light. Not through official records, but through the words of a dying pilot who wanted the world to know that in the darkest moment of the darkest war, a group of men found a way to be human to each other. The photographs found in 2003 captured something the world wasn't ready to see. Enemy soldiers sharing bread, guards and prisoners working side by side, men who were supposed to kill each other, choosing instead to save each other. For 6 weeks in a forgotten camp, the war stopped being about nations and ideologies. It became about whether we could recognize the humanity in the man standing across from us, even when everything told us he was the enemy. The historians still debate what it means. Was it an anomaly, a moment of weakness, or proof that even in total war, human beings can choose mercy over hate? There's no clear answer. History deals in moments, and this was a moment that 53 men carried for the rest of their lives. Most never spoke about it publicly. Shame, maybe, or fear,
or simply the knowledge that some experiences are too complex for words, too fragile to survive in a world that demands simple stories and clear sides. But the story exists, in letters and photographs, in accounts pieced together by historians who refuse to let it disappear. It exists as a question each generation must answer. When everything falls apart, when orders stop making sense, when survival becomes the only truth that matters, what do we choose? Do we cling to the hate we were taught? Or do we reach across the divide and recognize that the person on the other side is just as scared, just as cold, just as human as we are? Camp Edelweiss was forgotten by history, but 53 men remembered, and now we do too.